Hello and welcome to Analog IAS. In this session, I'll be discussing about 10 years of Paris Agreement. Now, before moving down to discuss something on the 10 years of Paris Agreement, we all know that at present, the planet Earth is having the triple planetary crisis. They are the climate change, loss of biodiversity, and air pollution. And all three are interconnected with each other. Now, if you take loss of biodiversity, the major factors for that is man-animal conflict, alien species, and the destruction caused by anthropogenic parameters. Now, pollutions, we are having air pollution, water pollution, then we also have plastic pollutions. So all these are associated with the degradation of the resources here. And among them, the most important crisis is the climate change. Now, what exactly is this climate change? In a very simple term, when we talk about the statistical data of temperature, precipitation, etc., when you accumulate this data for a longer period of a time, say around 30 years, so this data which is accumulated is referred as a climate. Now, when there is a variation in this data, we refer that as climate change. Now, at present, we have seen that there has been strong variations in the temperature, rainfall patterns, and also other fundamental elements of climatology. So, all they are being affected here. So, we refer that as climate change. Now, according to the IPCC, they say that the present climate change is mainly anthropogenic, that is man-made factor. It has highlighted that in its fourth assessment report that yes, it is a human involvement which is mainly associated with the present climate change. And the impact of climate change are seen in extreme weather conditions like we have experiencing the heat domes in many European countries, droughts in many countries including India, floods, cloud burstings, droughts, right? So we are experiencing extreme weather phenomena which are associated with the climate change, which are responsible for huge amount of socio-economic losses. Now, in this regard, I'll be discussing that, how we are coping up with the climate change perspectives. And I'll be discussing the chronology associated with that and how we reached to the Paris Agreement and what happened after the Paris Agreement and what should be expected in the next conference of parties which will be held in Belém, that is Brazil, right? Now, when we talk about the climate change perspective, the first and important aspect is something called as Stockholm Conference. Now, the Stockholm Conference was held in the year 1972. And in this conference, it created an international platform for the environmental issues. That should be kept in the mind, platform for environmental issues. And the second important outcome of this is, for the first time, it made a systematic linkage between economic development and environment. It highlighted that economic development and environmental concerns are the two faces of the same coin. And none of that can be neglected. Environment is also important. Economic development is also very, very important. Then, this conference is also responsible for setting up of an important institution which is called as United Nations Environment Program, which plays an important role in the climate change issues. It provides financial assistance part. It develops reports which coordinates with different agencies in the context of climate change perspectives. So this is an important aspect to begin with the climate change and environmental perspectives. Now, the second thing is something called as the Brundtland Commission, or it is also referred as World Commission on Environment and Development. Now, this commission was set up by United Nations General Assembly. Now, the major objective of this is to study the Brand report. And it is also to make assessment of the Brand line. And this Brand line is nothing but the geographic north and south divide based on their economic perspectives. Developed countries in the north and developed countries in the south. So, the Brundtland Commission was set up to study the Brand report or the Brand line, plus also to find a solution for the issues associated with the climate or environment. Now, this commission studied the data carefully, and after that it submitted its reports in the year 1987. And this report is referred as the Brundtland report. And this Brundtland report has a title called as Our Common Future. Right. And the important recommendations of this report is, while defining the report, it talks about a term which was coined during the report submission, and that is referred as sustainable development. So, for the first time, the term sustainable development was coined. And this sustainable development talks about three components, that is environmental concern, economic development, and it also talks about social equity. So, hence these are referred as the three components of sustainable development, which was highlighted by the Brundtland report. And all the developments has to be assessed on the basis of these three parameters. Then only we refer that as sustainable development. So, hence it made a vital linkage between environment, economic development, and also social equity. All three are interconnected. Along with that, it also said that all developed and developing countries should work together in the context of climate change issues or climate change crisis. Very important recommendations which are given by the Brundtland report. Now, after this Brundtland report, a significant step is the creation of IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this was formed in the year 1988 by two important institutions, World Meteorological Organization and United Nations Environment Program. Now, IPCC plays an important role in the climate change issues. It provides science-based data in the context of climate change. And these data which are provided by IPCC plays a vital role when negotiation and discussions are done in the Conference of Parties to UNFCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this IPCC also played an important role in taking up good decisions like Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement perspectives. And this IPCC also given its reports, which we refer them as assessment reports, which plays an important role in assessing the climate change and the role of human or anthropogenic factors in increasing the climate change perspectives there. Apart from that, it also gives special reports when requested or when asked. So, hence it plays an important role in providing the science-based inputs to the climate change issues. And all the data which are given by IPCC are very, very vital to assess the contribution and also to assess where we are leading in the present fight against the climate crisis or climate change issues. Now, after this, when IPCC was formed, it gave the data, and we had an idea that yes, the environment is having a major problem. And that is the reason why United Nations decided that why don't we can have a conference, why don't we can have a gathering where the developed countries and developing countries both will come together and they will discuss what problems they are facing and also to find a solution that how they are facing and what can be the effective part of that. And this response was accepted very effectively by developed as well as developing countries. And the response was the Earth Summit of 1992. It is also referred as Rio Summit of 1992. And this is referred as the largest summit in the context of environmental concern or climate change. Now, the important outcomes of this Rio Summit is that it created something called as Agenda 21. Now, Agenda 21 talks about the sustainable development or the blueprint of sustainable development for the 21st century. So that is Agenda 21, very important outcome. Apart from that, it is also responsible for creating 3 important conventions, international conventions. Now, the first one is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second one is Convention on Biological Diversity. And the third one is United Nations Convention for Combating Desertification. So 3 important conventions were created as an outcome of the Earth Summit or Rio Summit. Now, apart from that, it also created a financial arrangement to provide financial assistance to these 3 conventions plus other 2 conventions also, which are associated with the pollution. And that financial arrangement is called as Global Environment Facility. So this Global Environment Facility provided financial assistance to these 3 conventions, plus it also provides assistance to Stockholm Convention associated with the persistent organic pollutant, and also to the Minamata Convention, which is associated with mercury pollution. So financial arrangement was also created in the form of the Global Environment Facility. Now, the important part here is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in this regard, we'll discuss what is Paris Agreement and what is that Kyoto Protocol and where we are standing in this part. Now, the moment when you talk about the climate change issues, it was realized that the developed countries are the major contributors in the climate change because of their historical emission and also per capita emission. So due to their industrial activities which were taken by them, which emitted huge amount of greenhouse gas emission in the beginning of their industrial process, and also the per capita emission which is being done by them. But the impact of the global warming and climate change is felt very strongly on the island countries and poor countries in the form of droughts, floods, rise in the sea level, and etc. And that is the reason why a significant principle was created, which is referred as common but differentiated responsibilities with respective capabilities. Now, this common but differentiated responsibilities depends on the principle that all the countries, the developing as well as developed countries, should contribute in the context of the climate change issues what the entire globe is facing. Apart from that, differentiated responsibilities should be taken by the developed countries who are the major contributors of the climate change because of their historical emission and also the per capita emission. So hence, it is referred as common responsibilities where the developed as well as developing countries combinedly work towards the climate change issues. Then, differentiated responsibilities are associated with the developed countries. What developed countries has to provide? Developed countries has to provide financial assistance, and they also have to provide the technical assistance to the developing countries in the context of climate change issues for adaptation, for mitigation, etc. So this is referred as differentiated responsibilities. Then the third one is something called as respective capabilities. Now we have developed countries as well as developing countries. Developed countries have sufficient resources, economic resources, technical resources, or human resources in such a way that they can adapt to the impact of climate change very effectively. The losses will be comparatively less in them. So it means that they are having higher capacities in the context of adaptation to minimize the socio-economic losses in the event associated with the climate change. But if you take the poor countries and developing countries, so they do not have sufficient resources, maybe the technical resources or maybe the financial resources, which are not sufficient for them. And that is where we find during the event called as drought, floods, cloud burstings, etc., where they don't have proper adaptation, and that is where the losses are more in all these events, maybe heat waves, cold waves, all these, where they don't have effective adaptation. So hence, all the countries, they will have their own respective capabilities, and the nations will respond to the same way what they are having. So hence, it talks about huge technical and financial assistance to be delivered to the developing countries and poor countries to combat or to fight against the impact of climate change. So this becomes a foundation principle in the context of climate change issues, which is referred as CBDR and respective capabilities. Now after this, based on this, which becomes the foundation principle for the third conference of COP, the third conference of parties of UNFCCC, and all the decisions which are taken by that is referred as the Kyoto Protocol. And this Kyoto Protocol, in fact, is referred as the first strategy in the context of the climate change issues solutions. Now, what does this strategy talks about? The basis of the strategy is that it identified that the developed countries are the major contributors of climate change. And these developed countries, they have the greatest potential to reduce the impact of climate change by taking the binding of emission of greenhouse gases. So the first strategy talked about limiting the emission of greenhouse gas, or we say it is binding of the emission of greenhouse gases. This becomes the first strategy in the context of climate change, binding, limiting of emission of greenhouse gas. Now the problem started, which countries have to take binding and which greenhouse gases should be reduced or should be taken in the binding. Now for that, entire countries of the earth were classified into three categories. The first group is referred as Annex 1 categories, which is referred as the developed countries, plus they are the members of OECD, that is Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, plus whose economies are in transition. So these countries, they have to take the binding of emission of greenhouse gas. Then Annex 2 countries. So Annex 2 countries are also referred as the developed countries. They are also the members of OECD, plus their economies are not in transition. Not in transition. So such countries, they have to provide technical and financial assistance in the context of the climate change issues. Economies in transition means those who have moved to the open economies. Then the third group of countries is referred as non-Annex 1 countries. And non-Annex 1 countries are the developing countries which do not have any type of binding of emission of greenhouse gas, but these countries will get technical and financial assistance for their work which they do in the context of climate change. That is common responsibilities. So they will also have to play an important role in the context of climate change. For their role, they will be getting incentives in the form of financial assistance. And that is how the mechanism of Kyoto Protocol was done. And these all perspectives were responsible for creating something called as flexi mechanism. It created a flexi mechanism. And this flexi mechanism is also referred as international emission trading, which consists of clean development mechanism and joint implementation. And this is also referred as cap and trade. Cap and trade. Now here it is about trading the carbon credits. It is about the carbon credits which are created by the projects and also which have been saved. So these carbon credits which are sold and purchased in the international market created something called as carbon trade. So international emission trading, which consists of CDM and joint implementation, is nothing but the carbon trade, where the carbon credits are sold and purchased in the international market. And the value of one carbon credit or one Kyoto unit is 1 ton of carbon dioxide, or it is 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, which are having financial values. So these carbon credits, they are having the financial values, which are traded in the international market. And the countries which has the carbon credits, they have the right to emit that amount of greenhouse gas. So this is something which is associated with the carbon trade. Now if the trade is between the developed country and developing country, then we refer that as clean development mechanism. Now in the clean development mechanism, certified emission reductions are traded. So certified emission reductions are carbon credits which are traded in clean development mechanism, that is a trade between one developed country and a developing country. And joint implementation is a trade between two developed countries. And in this, the carbon credits which are traded is referred as emission reduction units. Now this clean development mechanism is something where the developing countries received the financial assistance from the developed countries for their contribution in creating the carbon credits by taking the activities like solar energy projects, wind energy projects, clean energy projects. So it means they are contributing in reducing the greenhouse gas emission, and in turn they get the financial assistance in the form of something which we refer as carbon offset trading is done. So this is something which is associated with the first strategy, which is referred as the Kyoto Protocol or carbon trade. Now the major problem associated with this is the country which was having the carbon credit has a right to emit the greenhouse gas. Now the second major thing associated with this project or this is that when they talk about the commitment periods of emission of greenhouse gas, so two commitment periods were there. The first commitment period was between 2008 to 2012, and it achieved very partial success. Very partial success was there to reduce the emission of greenhouse gas. And the second commitment period, which was from 2013 to 2020, it did not enter into force because of the ratification number which was required. So as there was no ratification number, so hence the second commitment period did not enter into the force. So hence the first strategy was not successful in addressing the climate change issues. And apart from that, many developed countries also started raising their voices that the countries like China, the countries like India, so they are also emitting greenhouse gases, and binding is not justified for only few countries. And even though when the binding is also there, they are unable to deliver the targets which have been done. In spite of having the funds like adaptation fund which was created, global environment facility which was there, but still there was a huge gap between the requirements and the needs and to tackle the climate change issues. And keeping these things in the mind, it was decided that we have to find a second strategy in the context of climate change, which will replace the Kyoto Protocol in the year 2020. And hence, it was decided to have a new strategy, and this new strategy is referred as Paris Agreement. Second strategy or new strategy in the context of climate change. And this new strategy will replace the Kyoto Protocol, right? And it has already replaced the Kyoto Protocol in the year 2020. It was adopted on 12th December 2015 and entered into force on 4th November 2016. Now, what exactly is this Paris Agreement? It says that all the countries, it can be developed country or developing countries, should contribute in the context of climate change. And it has made a global target of the average temperature which is increasing. And for the benchmark, it has taken as pre-industrial era. Pre-industrial era means 1850 to 1900. Now, in a very simple word, Paris Agreement says that whatever the average temperature the pre-industrial era is having, we should not increase the global average temperature beyond 2 degrees centigrade, that of the pre-industrial era. If possible, try to restrict it to 1.5. That is called as 2 degrees centigrade, or try effort to keep it below 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial temperature. Now, according to the data, what the World Meteorological Organization says, the average temperature for 1850 to 1900, according to the World Meteorological Organization, it was somewhere around 13.7 degrees. Right. Now, Paris Agreement says that it should not be more than 2 degrees beyond 13.7. If possible, try to keep it to 1.5 degrees. So that is the Paris Agreement global target of increasing the average temperature. And this temperature should be, or it should be maintained, or it should be achieved by end of the century. Now for that, the strategies used were, it asked all the countries to submit their intended national determined contribution, their strategies, their policies, their approach at the national level, state level and regional level. It asked all the countries to submit their intended national determined contribution in the context of climate change by the year 2018. And once they were submitted, then we refer them as national determined contribution. So all the countries has to provide their blueprint of how they are moving towards the climate change perspectives. This is very important. Third one is that when they submit their NDCs, they have to be revised, reviewed, and check has to be done. So hence, these will be reviewed every 5 years. Review of their achievement will be done every 5 years. We refer that as global stock take. We refer that as global stock take. And already the global stock take was done. So they submitted their NDCs in the year 2018. And the first global stock take was in the year 2023. Where they are reaching, where they are found, what are their policies. This is something associated with the NDC and also its assessment. Then it also talks about bringing more amount of transparency in all the policies associated with the Paris Agreement. It also talks about climate finance. Climate finance. So here it was affirmed, the developed countries affirmed in the Paris Agreement that they will be providing $100 billion every year from 2020 up to 2025. So these are the major aspects of the Paris Agreement. Now in the Paris Agreement, there was no word introduced in the beginning which is referred as carbon neutrality or net zero emission. So these are the major outcomes of Paris Agreement. It talks about transparency, it talks about mitigation, it talks about global stocktake, it talks about 5-year cycles of national determined contribution, and also climate finance, which has to be taken into consideration. So this is something which was the backbone of the Paris Agreement. And when it entered into the force in 2020, rule book was created and also certain arrangements were done. But what after that? The moment when we talk about the Paris Agreement and after that, we come across certain points. It all started, but there were many issues associated with that. The first and major issue associated with this was something called as the carbon trade part. Now, the developed countries were having a major problem to settle the carbon trade. Because in the Kyoto Protocol, it was told that the carbon trade is one of the important mechanisms where the developing countries will get a financial assistance. And as we moved from Kyoto Protocol to the second strategy, Paris Agreement, there were large amount of unsold carbon credits were there with the developing countries like Brazil, China and India. So they wanted to know that what they should do with these unsold carbon credits. And they also believed that if these unsold carbon credits issues was not settled, then how they will believe in the second strategy, that is Paris Agreement. So this created a deadlock during the conference of parties that how this carbon trade has to be done. Ultimately, after negotiation, it was decided that yes, these unsold carbon credits which are there, so they can use them in their first cycle of the national determined contribution. So they settled the first aspect of carbon trade. And also, something about carbon market was also settled in the COP 29, where they talked about creating a market for international trade. So somehow the carbon trade issue, which was the main point of the Paris Agreement and also about the Kyoto Protocol to be settled, was done as a part of Article 6. Now the second major problem associated here is something which is very significantly seen. We always talk about something called as mitigation and something called as adaptation and also something called as loss and damages, which were asked by the developing countries, but they were not completely fulfilled and there was no clarity on how to settle that. This was ambiguity since from the beginning of the negotiation. Now, in the context of their financial assistance, they said that, yes, we are providing the assistance for mitigation. Mitigation means providing financial assistance to move towards clean energies and all, so that they can reduce the emission of greenhouse gas. Reduce the emission of greenhouse gas. That is mitigation. So they were getting funds for mitigation. Then adaptation. Adapting in the context of climate change, like adaptation during floods, droughts, heat waves, etc. So they require a huge amount of financial assistance and technical assistance to protect themselves in the context of climate change issues or extreme weather conditions. So hence, adaptation is also very much required. Many poor countries, they don't have sufficient resources. Submergence of their coastal areas. Their demography is also not something where they can adapt to the principles of the pre-disaster managements here. So hence, they required huge amount of financial assistance in this part. And there was no clarity that where and how the money will be flowing in the mitigation and adaptation. And developing countries started that. In spite of mitigation and in spite of adaptation also, there are large amount of socio-economic losses. Now, how you will cover in this? So hence developing countries wanted that there should be a separate loss and damage fund should be created. That is, in spite of mitigation, in spite of adaptation, when the losses occur in the form of socio-economic losses, we need a separate fund to that. A separate fund which is called as loss and damage fund, which is needed in the context of the present climate issues. So this was the second major part. The third one is something about finance. So in the context of Paris Agreement and all, the developed countries also made some arrangement for the financial part. In the year 2009, which is referred as the Copenhagen Accord. So in the Copenhagen Accord, the developed countries agreed that, according to the Copenhagen Accord, the developed countries agreed that they will be providing $100 billion every year to the developing countries in the context of mitigation and adaptation to the climate change issues. And this $100 billion was reaffirmed in the Paris Agreement, where in the Paris Agreement they said that yes, we will be providing for a period of 2020 and up to 2025. Every year we will be providing $100 billion to the developing countries. And in spite of having 1, 2 or 3 years, that is 2021, 2022 and 2023, they did not have resources which can suffice the Paris Agreement commitment. So hence developing countries wanted a strong, effective financial mechanism which has to be replaced and which has to provide the requirement of the adaptation and mitigation. And when they raised their voices, they demanded that an effective financial mechanism is required. And that is where it was agreed that a new financial mechanism will be formed, and which is referred as new collective quantified goals. And this new collective quantified goals is something which will be replacing the Paris affirmed financial arrangements. So these were the things which are associated with the Paris Agreement, which has to be settled effectively. Right? And if you see the conference of parties which were held, some of them were settled very fast. Now the loss and damage fund was adopted in COP23. So it means, yes, now we can have something about loss and damage fund. Now how it will be affected, how it will be implemented, we have to wait and check for that. Then it also talked about something called as National Adaptation Plan. Now in the COP29, it asked all the countries that all the countries has to submit their National Adaptation Plan in the COP30 or before COP30, that is in the Bellum. Adaptation in the context of climate change issues. Then the climate finance, that is new collective quantified goal, was also set up in the year COP 2024 as a part of COP29, where they talked about tripling the financial to the developing countries, that is from $100 billion to $300 billion. Then it also visualized that the developing countries requires very huge money in the context of adaptation, mitigation, and also loss and damages. And they found that in spite of their domestic resources, the developing countries requires additional $1.3 trillion in the context of climate change issues. And that is where government of India and many countries raise their point that yes, we need $1.3 trillion in the context of climate change issues, because in spite of our domestic supports, we are having a gap of $1.3 trillion. And that is where That is where an effort to scale up the finance to the developing countries at the amount of $1.3 trillion per year was seen. And lastly, they talked about something, how to make effective part of that. In the recent summits and recent discussions, the global leaders, they decided that how to make up this Baku to Belem roadmap of 1.3. Now all the eyes will be in COP30 that how this Belem roadmap will take place, how this new collective quantified goal will enter, how effectively we will be having a national adaptation plan, and how we will handle the loss and damage plan. So hence the COP30 becomes very, very interesting in negotiating and discussing these parts. Apart from this, the recent data which are given by the different institutions are not encouraging. If you take the data which is given by Climate Action Tracker, which tracks about the global climate change actions from 2009, and it plays an important role after the Paris Agreement perspective. It says that if all the national determined contributions meet, if all the policies and actions are met, if all the targets are met by 2030, so in all the cases, we will be having the temperature, the global average temperature, which will be more than Paris Agreement. So it means we are not in a road to reach to the Paris Agreement. With all the NDCs, with all the pledges, and with all the targets, we are missing the Paris Agreement of 2 degrees centigrade or 1.5 degrees centigrade more than the pre-industrial level. So this is one. It is not the only one report. We also have the report, Emission Gap Report, and this is given by United Nations Environment Program. And this United Nations Environment Program also says that if all the commitments are met, we will be reaching to 3.1 degree temperature more than the pre-industrial era. And that is where we are unable to reach to the Paris Agreement. And apart from this, we also have something called as the National Determined Contribution Synthesis Report. And this synthesis report is given by United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now here also it highlighted that we are not in a position to reach to the Paris Agreement. And apart from this, the report which is given by World Meteorological Organization. So this World Meteorological Organization has also said that the pre-industrial temperature, that is 1850 to 1900, the global average temperature was 13.7 degrees centigrade. And it has calculated the global average temperature of 2024. And 2024 is considered as the warmest year. And here, the global average temperature was 15 degrees to 15 degrees and 1 degree centigrade. So hence, according to that, we are 1.3 degrees centigrade more than the pre-industrial mark. So it is a major alarming aspect that whatever decisions we are making, whatever targets we are doing, we are unable to reach to the Paris Agreement. And that is where they talked about something called as carbon neutrality. So unless and until carbon neutrality is done, this carbon budget cannot be protected. This carbon budget will not be efficient enough. Carbon budget is amount of the cumulative carbon dioxide emission which is allowed to reach the Paris Agreement. And that is where this carbon neutrality concept was introduced, which talks about geological carbon sequestration by using technologies like direct air capture and carbon capture and storage, etc. And for this, we require a technology. And that is why when all the countries are taking these also as an important perspective, India has also said that, yes, I will also reach to carbon neutrality by 2070. So many countries have set their target to reach carbon neutrality along with their national determined contribution. So hence at this stage, it is very important to assess that to reach the Paris Agreement, it is not the NDCs which are required. Along with effective NDCs, we also have to work towards something called as carbon neutrality or effective mechanism in carbon sequestration, that is carbon geological sequestration, or use that atmospheric carbon dioxide in some type of economic productivity. And then only we can have a Paris Agreement to enter into reality. This is all about the Paris Agreement and the 10 years of Paris Agreement. And if it has to be met, then we have to watch the COP30 Belém, Brazil as one of the important game decider whether you will reach to the Paris Agreement or not, and adaptation part, loss and damage, mitigation fund, and how the arrangements will be done. Because at this stage we find many developing countries are having the major issues in the context of climate change. So by this I'll end my session. Thank you.